In the day-to-day operation of the parliament, the government's finding things more difficult as well.
The biggest story in Canberra at the moment is the Senate and how Lidia Thorpe's defection from the Greens is making life so much harder for the government to get their agenda through. Already the government has had to agree to a concession in relation to the legislation around the referendum for the voice, with Special Minister of State Don Farrell telling Jane Hume, his shadow, that the government will support the coalition amendment to the referendum machinery bill involving a yes and no case pamphlet going to every household in Australia. But in relation to the request for public funding, the coalition is asking for both yes and no campaigns. It's a no so far from the government. Opposition leader Peter Dutton wants $7.5 million per side, plus inflation.
From memory, the funding in the referendum on the Republic was about $7.5 million for each side. I think it's reasonable that, not an exorbitant amount of money, but enough money for the administrative costs or for the basic costs for both sides. The question, honestly, that I think you've got to contemplate if you're talking about any change to the Constitution is what interpretation can then be made by the High Court, and that's something the Prime Minister hasn't explained in relation to what he's proposing at the moment.
So you talk about that changed Senate crossbench. Jackie Lambie wants the pamphlets, so she'll go with the government and opposition on that, but the government believes it may be able to get her support on zero public funding for both sides. That's what Anthony Albanese wants. So with Lambie, Pocock and the Greens, the bill can then get up. The government's been talking with the opposition about this since last week. Got to say, it was only a few weeks ago. The most important discussions going on in this building were between Anthony Albanese and David Pocock and Anthony Albanese and Adam Bandt. With Lidia Thorpe going independent, likely to go any which way, that situation has now changed. So much so that we had Industry Minister Ed Husic desperately trying to get hold of Deputy Liberal leader Susan Lee this morning to try to get the bill setting up the National Reconstruction Fund through.
They're taking the National Reconstruction Fund legislation, they're rushing it through the Parliament. Another example of rushed legislation. It's a $15 billion fund. It's not wise expenditure.
So here is all the legislation held up at the moment. Bit of a logjam there. There's three items. In relation to the National Reconstruction Fund and the legislation and regulations around the Safeguards Mechanism carbon credit scheme that the government is trying to introduce, the Greens want coal and gas projects excluded from both those schemes, so they're not offering their support at the moment. And the government finds the Greens' position on the National Reconstruction Fund puzzling, to say the least, given that the fund's not about coal mines, it's about manufacturing and, in terms of energy, if anything, transitioning. Here is Energy Minister Chris Bowen's only statement, meanwhile, on the coalition blocking the safeguard mechanism. One word: Michael Jordan style. I guess that's in reference to the fact it was the Abbott government who first introduced the safeguards mechanism system, although Peter Dutton said today this scheme is compulsory and the coalition's wasn't.
Our position's been clear. This is a tax that's being imposed. It's 3 times the tax that Julia Gillard proposed. It's going to drive up the cost of living, and Australians at the moment are sitting there doing their budgets, not working out how they're going to pay for everything that they've got stacking up on their kitchen table. They've got bills after bill after bill.